Okay, so we're going to start part one of the Cold War today. And we're going to start with the second Red Scare. Now, you remember that after World War I, there was a Red Scare in the United States as Americans became afraid that immigrants would bring communist ideas over from the newly communist Soviet Union or its neighboring nations. And the target of that Red Scare then, of course, is immigrants in America. Immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe and labor union workers as well, because again, the fear was that workers would bring that revolution to America. Now, there's going to be a second Red Scare then after World War II. Again, it's a fear of communism in the United States, but it's not going to be targeted. It's not going to be targeting immigrants. This second Red Scare is focused primarily on the possible threat of communism within the United States. Communist Americans in the arts and entertainment, communist professors in universities, and communists in government. Now, for your journal, you're going to read an excerpt from a speech from Senator Joseph McCarthy, Republican from Wisconsin, who really is kind of the poster boy for this second Red Scare. His name is attached to it. McCarthyism is the practice of publicly accusing someone of subversive or communist activities without really any evidence to support your accusations. The speech that you're going to read the excerpt from, he made in 1950 and really set this nationwide fear of communism off in the United States. You're also, though, going to read an excerpt from a speech from another Republican senator, Senator Margaret Chase Smith from Maine. She's the same party as McCarthy, but obviously you're going to see that she does not agree with his tactics. She does not agree with the accusations and smears of people's reputations that McCarthy and others were engaging in, and as you'll see, she will contend in her speech that freedom of speech is just not what it used to be in America. So I look forward to reading your journals there. But we need to think about what it is that's going on internationally that is helping to create this fear of communism in America. And so we will begin by taking a look at President Harry Truman, who you remember became president after Roosevelt's death in 1945. And Truman will be president until 1953. Now, in 1947, events overseas will result in the United States putting together a policy, essentially, about how it would deal with communism in the world. That's known as the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine, and again, 1947. Essentially, the Truman Doctrine says this, and I'll quote it and then we'll break it down. Quote, "I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." In other words, attempted subjugation means communism. Armed minorities may refer to communists within a nation trying to overthrow democratic or at least semi-democratic governments. Outside pressures would mean communist forces from outside a nation attempting to bring communism into that nation. So essentially, with the Truman Doctrine, Truman commits the United States to support any people throughout the world who are resisting communism, whether it be coming from its own people or from outside intervention. Now, he did not necessarily mean military support. He just said support. but he didn't rule it out either. So it was pretty flexible. You know, how do you support people who are resisting communism? And we'll kind of see as we go along. 1947 will also see. 1947 will also see the beginnings of the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was an economic aid program designed to rebuild the economies of Europe that had been so devastated by war. Under the Marshall Plan, the United States is going to pump approximately $13 billion in loans and grants, mostly grants, to the nations in green on that map to assist them in rebuilding their economy, in getting people back to work and creating a prosperous economies and nations. Now, the Marshall Plan made a lot of sense because the United States does need trade with Europe in order to keep its economy growing, and the American economy is doing fantastic after World War II, we should note, because it's one of the few nations that had not been physically devastated by war. But the Marshall Plan was also part of a larger policy, a Cold War strategy really, known as containment. The idea was to contain communism where it existed and not let it grow any further. In other words, contain communism in Eastern Europe, where the Soviets had imposed those governments after the war, but try to keep it out of the Western European nations. And the idea is that if Western European economies were prosperous, if people had jobs and stability and access to consumer goods, that they wouldn't be interested in communism. So even if communism came knocking at their door, in a sense, from Eastern Europe, the people of Western Europe would resist. So they too would be contributing to this policy of containment. Keep communism where it existed. Don't let it spread into Western Europe. Don't let it spread anywhere where it already was not in existence. All right, before we go on to the next event then, and remember, these are just thumbnail sketches. I'm just trying to get you familiar with some of the basic things that are happening as this Cold War gets underway. Let's see what's going on in Germany. At the end of the war, Germany was occupied by the victorious Allied powers. The country was essentially divided up into 4 occupation zones. You see on the map the Soviet zone in red, the British zone in green, the French zone in blue, the American zone in kind of yellow-orangey. And again, you occupy a country to do what? You occupy a country to bring stability back, to get the electricity back on, get normalcy back in place, and then to allow free elections, right? So that the people of those nations will eventually be able to govern themselves. A lot of the German occupation also included the denazification of the population, in a sense, to ensure that Nazism did not reemerge. So let's note that the British, the French, and the Americans pretty much occupied their zones as one. Same rules for all 3 of those zones. The Soviets, on the other hand, they kind of did their own thing and ran their zone a little differently. But let's also note that the capital of Germany, Berlin, here, is right smack dab in the middle of the Soviet zone. Now, a nation's capital, a defeated capital, you don't want just one of the allies to be able to administer that important capital city. And so Berlin itself was also divided among the 4 allies. You've got the Soviet zone of occupation in the east, the French zone, the the British zone and the American zones here in the West. And again, the British and the French and the Americans are going to run their zone pretty much in sync, and the Soviets, again, will do their own thing. Now, the Soviet Union wasn't all that thrilled with this. They kind of feel like Berlin ought to belong to them completely, that Berlin, in the middle of their zone of occupation, should be administered completely by the Soviet Union. And so in 1948, in an attempt to force all of Berlin to comply with the Soviet rules of occupation, again in 1948, the Soviet Union instituted a blockade of Western Berlin. In other words, nothing could get into Berlin, to West Berlin, from the Western zones of occupation by truck or by train. So they're going to blockade all the ground transportation. In a sense, they're trying to starve out the West Berliners. If West Berlin is not getting the food that they need from the West, if they're not getting the supplies, the coal, the oil, whatever, if they're not getting what they need from the British, French, and American zones of occupation, then they have no choice but to turn to the Soviets, and thus the Soviets would be able to absorb the entire city into their zone of occupation. What we're going to find is the Americans are not going to let that happen. The Americans, the Soviets may have blockaded the ground transportation, but they can't blockade the skies. And so beginning in 48 then and into 1949, the United States will carry out the Berlin Airlift, flying huge cargo planes over the Soviet zone of occupation, land them right down in West Berlin, and bring the Berliners the food and the energy and the coal and the oil and everything else that they need to sustain themselves, so that they won't have to turn to the Soviets for existence. This was a very ambitious project, and it works. In 1949, about a year after the blockade was implemented, the Soviets will lift that blockade and will allow, once again, the trains and the trucks to get in to West Berlin. Now, this crisis in Berlin, however, is going to lead the Allies to make some decisions. And so in 1949, it was decided that the occupation, in a sense, would end, and two new German states, two new German nations would be created. And so West Germany would be created from the French, British, and American zones of occupation. East Germany from the Soviet zone of occupation. West Germany would be a democratic government, capitalist in nature. East Germany, communist. Now, Berlin is still, as you can see, right smack dab in the middle of East Germany, but it was also decided to divide Berlin. West Berlin would belong to West Germany. East Berlin would belong to East Germany. West Berlin would be capitalist, democratic. East Berlin, communist. Now we don't have the wall yet, okay? The Berlin Wall is not built immediately. We're going to get to that a little bit later. But what you do have now is Germany divided. All Germans not living in one Germany, and thus this will, in a sense, symbolize the division of Europe here, because after World War II, you've got Europe itself divided. The West is going to be democratic, the East communist, and now you've got Germany divided. The West, democratic, the East, communist, and Berlin itself divided. The West, democratic, the East, communist. Also in 1949, an alliance was formed. 1949 will see the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which is, and listen closely, NATO is a collective defense agreement, pledging that an attack against one of the NATO allies would be considered an attack against them all. Now let's hear that again. An attack against one member of NATO would be considered an attack against them all. This is collective security. And remember Article 10 from the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles, right? Same thing. And you remember all the stink that the American Senate put up in opposition to Article 10. But after a Second World War, which was bloodier than the first, after World War II, Woodrow Wilson's vision of collective security seemed to make a lot of sense. And so NATO will pass in the United States Senate easily with a vote of 82 to just 13 in opposition. And thus you see on the map the original members of NATO in yellow, collective security agreements, an attack against one of those members of NATO, an attack against them all. NATO, of course, is still in existence. It has grown. There are more nations that are NATO members today. This alliance has helped to keep the peace since World War II. We should also note in 1948, you just backtrack a year, the United Nations was formed. The United Nations, essentially just exactly what the League of Nations should have been after World War I. The United Nations, an association of nations with the mission of preserving the peace. And we should also note that the United States also enthusiastically supported the formation of the UN. And in fact, they hosted the organizing meeting to establish the UN in San Francisco. New York is one of the headquarters of the UN, the other in Switzerland. Again, World War II. It was clear that Woodrow Wilson's vision back after World War I was now being adopted wholeheartedly. However, we should note that in 1955, the Soviet Union is going to form their own collective security organization, a counterweight to NATO when they organized the Warsaw Pact Treaty Organization. The nations in red on that map, the Soviet Union and their Eastern European satellite nations making up that alliance. Generally, this is just simply known as the Warsaw Pact. It no longer exists, but let's just note that with the creation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, essentially the sides were chosen in case of the Cold War ever turning into a hot war. If fighting breaks out, if war breaks out between the Soviets and the Americans and their allies, the sides were fixed, right? It would be the NATO nations versus the Warsaw Pact nations. And if you look at it from this North Pole orientation, I can almost see the bombs flying over the North Pole, a nuclear war. And, if war ever broke out, it was going to be nuclear. Would have obliterated essentially the northern hemisphere of the globe. right, 1949, along with the creation of NATO, the creation of West Germany and East Germany, we're going to see communism coming to China. In 1949, China completed a long civil war that brought Mao Zedong and the Communist Party to in control of China, and the People's Republic of China, then communist nation, the nation with the largest population on the face of the earth, became communist. In that same year, the Soviet Union will successfully test its first atomic weapon. The Soviet Union now has the bomb. And so the United States no longer had a monopoly on nuclear weaponry. And President Truman responded to the Soviet bomb by ordering American scientists and military folks to create an even more powerful nuclear weapon. Let's build a hydrogen bomb. And the United States begins to build its military as well. And this sets off the arms race, really, with both the Soviet Union and the United States having nuclear weapons, with both now trying to create even more powerful, bigger bombs, hydrogen bombs, and whatever else. We are now going to see the numbers of nuclear weapons in the world begin to increase. The Korean War is the last Cold War event of the Truman administration, and it marks the first military battle of the Cold War. Now again, the United States and the Soviet Union will never directly fight one another. But the United States will be involved not only in Korea, but later in Vietnam in fighting communism. And we should note that when Americans were fighting communism, to them, they're fighting the Soviets. They're fighting to, again, contain communism and keep it from growing. So we consider the Korean War and the Vietnam War as proxy wars in the Cold War. Again, the United States and the Soviet Union never directly fight each other. But that doesn't mean that the American military isn't going to be fighting communism. So let's get some background on Korea. Korea had been under the control of the Japanese, you remember, in the 1930s. And when World War II ended, Korea then will be occupied by the victorious Allies. The Americans occupied the southern part of the Korean Peninsula, and the Soviet Union the north. Now remember, the Soviet Union had joined the war in the Pacific on the side of the Americans between the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs. So technically they're on the side of the victors, and now they'll be a part of the occupation forces in Korea. During the occupation then, a democratic government was formed in South Korea, and note the division line, please. The division line is here, the 38th parallel. And those geographic lines we use to divide the world up where we can kind of understand it. So a democratic government had formed in the South under the American occupation, and a communist government had formed in the North under the Soviets. By the end of 1948, both occupation forces had withdrawn, but it left Korea with 2 different governments. Communism in the North, democracy in the South. It was kind of left up to the Koreans then as to how to reunify, and they could not agree on this. But in 1950, North Korea attempted to reunify the nation by force. North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. Beginning in June of 1950. Now, the United States believes that the Soviet Union was behind this, and that's not totally clear even today. But nevertheless, Truman ordered American forces to South Korea then to aid the South in their fight. The United Nations will also authorize 14 other nations to send troops to aid the South in their fight, but the vast majority of the troops that will be fighting with the South were American. Now, let's just note on the map, and the initial invasion by the North, crossing the 38th parallel, began in June of 1950, and look just how far. Look just how. Let me find my cursor here. Look how far the North was able to get into South Korea before American troops and other UN troops began to arrive. But once they did arrive, by September of 1950, you're going to start seeing the South and the Americans and their allies pushing the North Koreans back further and further and further out of South Korea. And note here, this line, this was as far as the UN forces were able to get in pushing the North Koreans back. But that was just in 1950. This war is going to last for a couple more years, and between in 1951 and 52, what we're going to see is a constantly moving front in Korea, as the North may make some headroads getting down south, and the South then begins to push the North Koreans back. It's just a back and forth fighting front for the next couple of years. In 1953, a truce was called. An agreement was made to stop the fighting, take the decision about Korea, in a sense, to a peace conference. Let me see if I can't get something a little more. Here we go. And note where that truce line is. Here's the truce line. This is where the fighting stopped. And this today is the border between North Korea and South Korea. 3 years of fighting, and it ends up being almost exactly the same spot where it began, right? Again, the fighting was negotiated to a truce, but the Korean War has never officially ended. There are still North Korean troops and South Korean troops at this border, this demilitarized zone, daily marching, threatening each other in a sense. Is anyone going to fire their guns first? American troops are still stationed in Korea, doing their part I guess trying to keep this thing from heating up again. Korea remains divided today, as you know, with a hardline communist dictatorship in place, and no real progress in trying to either officially end this war or bring the Koreas back together again. Let's just note the casualties. And these are death numbers only, but in the 3 years of American involvement in Korea, the United States the deaths of American soldiers is about 36,000. 36,000 American dead. South Korean civilian and military deaths, and remember, they're fighting this on South Korean and North Korean soil, so a lot of the casualties will be civilian as well as military. South Korean deaths total about 595,000. North Korean civilian and military, about 1.3 million dead. Total Korean death toll, then North and South, almost 2 million. And the war is officially still going on. All right, in 1952, the United States will elect as their president Dwight Eisenhower. It's Eisenhower, actually in 1953, whose administration will finalize the truce in Korea in order to hopefully try to end that war. Now, Dwight Eisenhower was a Republican, and he had been a general in World War II. He'd been the commander, in fact, of all of the Allied forces on D-Day. Again, he became president in 1953, winning the 52 election. He will serve for 2 terms. And under Eisenhower, the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, began to be involved in the Cold War. Now, the CIA was a spy organization, an intelligence agency, right, that had formed out of, formed as a result of World War II. And what we're going to see is that twice during Eisenhower's administration, the CIA is going to overthrow foreign governments that were thought to be hostile to American interests. They're going to overthrow foreign governments that were thought to be communist allies. The first one, 1953, in Iran. Now, a little background. Up until 1953, Iran had been ruled by a royal family. The royal ruler in early 53 was Shah Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran. Okay. Now, the people of Iran, however, had overthrown the Shah early in 1953. They wanted him out. He leaves the country, goes to Paris, and lived in exile. And in 1953, the people of Iran, in a democratic election, chose as their prime minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Again, a democratically elected leader of a new Iran, in a sense. Now, the Shah had always been a Western ally who had allowed British and American companies to dominate and control Iran's oil industry. After World War II, you're starting to see a lot of oil being found in the Middle East, and Iran is an important producer of oil and gasoline. Iran's oil, though, is controlled by American companies and by British companies. Mohammad Mossadegh isn't happy with that. Mohammad Mossadegh believes that Iranians ought to control their own oil industry, not these foreign companies from the United States and Britain. And that kind of shakes up the Americans and the Brits. They'd be losing a lot of money if they no longer had access or control of Iranian oil production. And so the CIA, then working with the British intelligence group Mi6, is going to force Iran's elected prime minister from power in 1953. They're going to engineer a coup. It's all secret and underground with spies and networks, just like a movie. But the result is Mohammad Mossadegh is forced out of power, and the United States is going to bring back the Shah. Bring back the Shah from exile in Paris to run Iran again. Now, again, the Shah is really happy to have the British and the Americans dominate the Iranian oil industry. So he's thrilled. Shah is thrilled to come back to power. And in fact, he's so grateful that he is going to give the United States a 40% share of Iranian oil production for the next 25 years, ensuring then that the United States will have plenty of nice, cheap gas throughout the 1950s and 1960s. That will help them to thrive and prosper with. And you got to sit down for this. You know, gas was as low as maybe 50 cents a gallon. So the CIA has successfully overthrown a democratically elected government in Iran because they feared that Mossadegh might try to take over, or push out American and British oil interests, which to the Americans and the Brits sounds a little too much like, you know, communism. Next, the CIA did it again in Guatemala. The CIA will engineer a coup to remove the democratically elected president of Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz. Now, again, there's a lot of American companies in the fruit producing industry in Guatemala, making lots and lots of money on Guatemalan land using cheap Guatemalan labor. Arbenz wants to get those American companies out of Guatemala. Again, let the Guatemalans, you know, profit from their own work. And again, this seemed to threaten American interests, and again, seemed a little like communism. You know, communists come in and they take control of all the industry and all the food production. And so the CIA will overthrow Arbenz in 1954, and they will install an American friendly government in power in Guatemala. Again, the United States has forced from office a democratically elected leader of a foreign country. Now, do these incidents not represent gross interferences in the internal affairs of sovereign nations by the United States? I mean, do you think the United States would be happy if somebody, you know, if some foreign nation sent their spies in to overthrow the American president? But we should note that in this Cold War atmosphere, Americans see this as acceptable. The defenders of these coups said the following, quote, "It is clear we are facing an enemy whose avowed objective is world domination by whatever means and at whatever cost. There are no rules in such a game." In other words, all's fair in love and Cold War, right? That the United States feels it can do anything as long as it's under the guise of fighting communism. Now let's note that at this point in time, by the middle of the 1950s, both the United States and the Soviet Union had acquired the new, more powerful hydrogen bombs, and they had both built strong nuclear arsenals to the point where a balance of terror, in a sense, existed between these two nations. You know, both nations had the means to destroy the other in a matter of minutes. You know, if one nation fired nuclear weapons on the other, it was pretty much a given that the other would fire back. It was mutually assured destruction. That if these weapons were going to be used, nobody would really survive. And yes, that's mad. mutually assured destruction. And if you're looking closely at the pictures of the mushroom clouds, you may note the face of a clown in those pictures. It's a satirical reference, really, to the insanity of this arms race, to the insanity of the idea that these nations could destroy each other and much of the world if they ever actually deployed those weapons. Maybe it helped to keep the peace. I don't know. Maybe just the knowledge that if your nation fired their first shot, that nobody would survive that war. Maybe that kept those bombs from being used. In 1956, the United States is going to begin a high-tech spying program over the Soviet Union when the CIA, working with the Air Force, developed the U-2 spy plane, a plane that could fly out of the range of Soviet weaponry, extremely high altitudes, yet could also take highly detailed photographs of the ground below, extremely sophisticated photography equipment. They're going to begin flying those the U-2 planes over the Soviet Union in 1956. Again, taking pictures that could tell you just exactly how many tanks were on a base, how many planes were could be seen from the air. Just how much does the Soviet military have? I mean, these photographs were so detailed they could you could read the license plates numbers on cars. Now the Soviet Union knows those planes are up there. They can see them on the radar, but they can't shoot them down. They can't get them out of the air. So for the moment, they're going to keep quiet. They're not going to accuse the United States of anything. They're just going to kind of allow those planes to fly for a bit, and we'll come back to the U-2 in a little bit. But we should also note that it was during the Eisenhower administration that the United States first becomes involved in Vietnam. Now, prior to World War II, you may remember that Vietnam was part of French Indochina, the French colony that included Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The Japanese had taken control of Indochina in 1940, you may remember, and so after the war was over, what we find is that that Vietnamese nationalists, Vietnamese people who wanted Vietnam to be its own nation, right, no longer a colony of France, began to work to gain Vietnamese independence from France. The leader of that nationalist independence movement was Ho Chi Minh. Now, as Vietnam tries to gain its independence after the war in the late 40s and early 50s, the United States supported its ally France. They gave a lot of money to the French to try to help them defeat the nationalist movement, to keep Vietnam as their colonial, as a colony of France. But the French were defeated in this attempt to keep control of Vietnam in 1954. Ho Chi Minh's forces in 1954 established a communist government in North Vietnam, and an opposition government was created in the South. I'm not going to say it was a democratic government because it was an extremely corrupt government, but they were indeed against the communist North. and these two governments began to try to sit down and figure out ways that they could reunify Vietnam to create one nation out of the two governments that had emerged. But by 1956, fighting between the North and the South had begun. A civil war broke out in Vietnam. Now, the United States is going to back the South, right? So an opposition government had been formed in the South in opposition to the communist North. Again, it's a corrupt government. It wasn't very democratic, but at least they weren't communist. So the United States will support the South, and Eisenhower will make the decision when the Civil War begins to send American military advisors to Vietnam to help train the South Vietnamese troops and advise them on how they can defeat the North. Now, Eisenhower is going to send 2,000 military advisors to Vietnam. Now, again, they're not combat troops. They're not involved in the actual fighting. They're there to train. They're there to assist. But 2,000 American military advisors went to Vietnam in 1956. We're going to leave it there for now, but we'll see Vietnam a little bit later on. In 1955, we should note there was a bit of a breakthrough in at least communications between the Soviets and the Americans and their other allies. In 1955, there is a summit meeting in Geneva, Switzerland, where the former Allied powers, United States, Great Britain, or United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union, their leaders will meet for the first time since the end of World War II. Now, they'd really not been communicating very much. Again, the Cold War had really begun to get underway. These former allies didn't seem to need each other anymore. But in 1955, they met to talk, to discuss. Now, we should note that Joseph Stalin, who had led the Soviet Union through World War II, Stalin had died in 1953. His successor is Nikita Khrushchev. And so it's Khrushchev who is speaking with Eisenhower and the other leaders on behalf of the Soviet Union. Now, the summit meeting really did not produce much of anything new in policies, but it did represent an opening in communications now between these former allies. It did mean something, that these leaders had actually met in person and talked to one another. And so maybe after this summit meeting, there might have been some hope among many that this Cold War would eventually just peter out. But in 1957, the Soviet Union succeeded in doing something that pretty much shocked and rocked the American world. In 1957, the Soviet Union succeeded in launching the world's first man-made satellite into orbit. It was a little satellite called Sputnik. The satellite collected weather data. It was in orbit for about 3 months before it burned up and fell back down to Earth, as satellites often do. But this was the first time that humanity had launched a satellite into orbit around the globe. And the launch of Sputnik sent the American people and government into crisis. Oh no, they said. The Soviets are beating the Americans into space. Right? The Americans had been trying to send their own satellite up, but it kept failing. So we're going to see Americans go absolutely nuts here. Congress will allocate monies for education in science and math. We've got to beat the Soviets in science. We've got to beat them in space. The nation began to worry about the future of Space exploration. Will space be communist? You know, will the moon be a communist colony? How can the United States handle this? The space race, folks, has begun. The Cold War moves into space as American scientists went into high gear, and by 1958 launched their own satellite finally successfully into orbit and established the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, now to kick off the American space program in earnest. So not only do we have the Cold War on Earth, they're going to have it out in outer space as well. Now in 1959, a new Cold War front opened in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of the United States, remember, when Fidel Castro comes to power in Cuba. Castro overthrew a dictator in Cuba, but it ends up that he's going to ally with the Soviet Union. Soviet Union willing to help him to industrialize and modernize the Cuban economy. Now with this, then, with communism in Cuba, we're going to find that President Eisenhower authorized the CIA to begin planning for the overthrow of the Castro government. I mean, really, it had worked in Iran, right? It had worked in Guatemala. So why couldn't the CIA also, remove from power this communist ally, Fidel Castro, in Cuba? Now we should note then that the plans for the operation, however, had not yet been completed when Eisenhower's second term was finished in 1961. And so the plan to overthrow Castro is going to be left for his successor, John Kennedy. We'll get there in a few minutes. But finally, let's note, in the last year of the Eisenhower administration in 1960, the Soviets succeeded in shooting down a U-2 plane. Now, this was a big deal. The United States had thought that they could keep those spy planes flying forever, that the Soviets would never get the technology to be able to down one of those planes. The United States had taken great pains to ensure that there were no markings on the plane to indicate that they were American, that the pilots were all retired American military, so they're not wearing uniforms with insignias, right? And we should also note that the pilots of these planes had also been issued suicide devices, so that if they ever were captured, they could take one for the team. They could inject themselves with poison and not have to be captured. But again, in 1960, the Soviet Union was able to shoot down an American plane. The plane was largely intact when it crashed. They were able to get a lot of information and technological knowledge from that aircraft, and the pilot had survived. He had not killed himself. His name was Gary Powers. The picture on the right is Powers when he was in Soviet custody. The pilots had been kept pretty much in the dark as to just exactly what their missions were, so he really didn't have a lot of information to give to the Soviets, but it was quite clear he was an American. It was quite clear, really, to the Soviets, as if they didn't already know this was an American plane. And so Eisenhower first tried to disavow all knowledge of the plane. Oh, we don't know about any spy plane. It's not ours, and even if it is, it's just collecting weather data. But eventually, Eisenhower had to admit that the United States had indeed been collecting information with these flights, which were technically against international law, and fess up to the fact that they were indeed using everything they had in their arsenal to try to get information and defeat communism. Again, all was fair in love and Cold War, yeah. Gary Powers spent a couple of years in Soviet custody, but in 1962 was exchanged for a Soviet spy that the Americans held and returned to the United States. So with that, part 1 of the Cold War is over. We'll start looking at part 2 next. And again, remember, we're looking at thumbnail sketches. We're not looking at great detail in anything. We want to understand the basic defining events of this pretty perilous few decades of the Cold War. Thanks.